My name is Claire, and I still remember the morning when a single cup of coffee nearly ended my life. It was sitting right in front of me on the table, steaming gently as ordinary as any other morning ritual. Yet in my eyes, it was no different than a loaded gun. People imagine danger in the dark alleys of a city, or in the face of strangers, but mine arrived in a porcelain mug handed to me by the man who vowed to love me. Alexander smiled as he set it down. That same smile he always wore when he tried to make me feel small, when he told me that my promotion at the firm was nothing but luck, when he dismissed every late night I had poured into my cases. It was the same smile I saw 3 months ago, as I lay in a hospital bed weak and trembling from what doctors called food poisoning. I survived then. I was not so sure I would survive today. I leaned closer. The smell made my stomach twist. Sweet at first, but under it lingered something sharp and chemical. Bitter almonds. My heart skipped. Years ago in a college chemistry lecture, my professor had told us how cyanide gave off that faint scent. Some people could detect it, others could not. I was one of the unlucky few who could. At the time, it felt like an odd party trick. Now that genetic quirk was the only thing keeping me alive. I glanced at Alexander. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, watching every movement of my hand. His knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the table. He wanted me to drink. His mother sat nearby, silent lips pressed into the same thin line I had come to dread every day for the past 6 months. Eleanor. She shifted in her chair with the air of a judge waiting for a verdict. "Drink up, honey," Alexander said, his voice dripping with forced affection. The words sent chills down my spine. I lifted the cup slowly, my hand steady, though inside I was trembling. I raised it just high enough to hide behind it to give myself cover as I studied him. His smile faltered. For a flicker of a second, I saw something raw in his eyes. Was it panic? Was it disappointment? He wanted me to take that sip. He needed me to. My instincts screamed. I set the cup back down and pushed my chair back. "I need the bathroom," I muttered. My voice sounded foreign brittle, but it was enough. Eleanor's voice cut through the air like glass. "It's getting cold. Alexander went through so much trouble to make it special for you." Her tone was not concern, it was command. I nodded without meeting her eyes and walked away, each step deliberate. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain they could hear it echo down the hall. Behind me, Alexander murmured something, and Eleanor's reply was a sharp hiss I could not catch. I locked the bathroom door and pressed both palms against the cool porcelain sink. This was no accident. I had been sick before. I had brushed it off as stress, exhaustion, anything to avoid the truth. But the truth had a taste, a smell, and it was right there in that coffee. For a moment I stared at my reflection, pale skin, hollow cheeks. A woman worn thin, not by overwork, but by betrayal dripping slowly daily into her veins. I whispered to myself, not this time. I knew then that everything was about to change. When I returned from the bathroom, Alexander was sitting exactly where I had left him, the picture of patience. But I knew better. Behind that carefully rehearsed smile was something jagged and cruel, a truth he'd tried to bury beneath charm. He had always worn that smile like a mask, the one he flashed at dinner parties, the one he wore when he told colleagues that my promotion was simply luck. "Don't let it get to your head, Claire," he had said, almost laughing. But there had been no humor in his eyes, only disdain. It was the same smile I had seen 3 months earlier when I woke in a hospital bed after days of vomiting and unbearable pain. The doctors chalked it up to bad food, a case of food poisoning. But as I stared into Alexander's bright eyes, then I had wondered. Now, sitting at the dining table again, my doubts had hardened into certainty. He pushed the cup closer to me. "Drink. You'll feel better." His voice carried a warmth that would have fooled anyone else, but not me. I noticed the way his fingers trembled, the way his gaze locked on my lips, as though waiting for the moment of no return. My skin crawled. He wasn't just offering me coffee. He was daring me to trust him one last time. I forced a smile and slid back into my chair. The porcelain cup still released that faint, bitter scent haunting me. Eleanor sat like a silent referee between us, her sharp eyes catching every flicker of hesitation on my face. For months she had been there watching me, judging me, correcting, even the smallest things I did. A broken hip was her excuse, but control was her true intention. And now I wondered, was she only watching, or was she helping? I kept my hands folded in my lap, stalling. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to run, but I couldn't. If I left, they would try again. If I confronted him without proof, I would be painted as paranoid, unhinged. I needed more than suspicion. I needed evidence. So I played along. It smells sweet, I said softly, buying time. His smile widened, though his knuckles were still white. Special blend, just for you. Inside my chest tightened. Special. Poison was what he meant. And here's where I pause to tell you something, because this is more than a story. It's a reminder. If you're listening right now, wherever you are, let me know in the comments what country or city you're tuning in from. I want to know who's sitting at this table with me sharing this story. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing. That way you won't miss what comes next. Because trust me, what comes next is something you will not believe. I picked up the cup again, feeling the heat against my skin, pretending to consider it. The aroma rose, bitter almonds cutting through the steam. Cyanide. I remembered the words from my professor years ago. It kills by stealing your breath, binding your blood, suffocating you from within. My pulse hammered in my ears. Alexander's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, as if he could will me to drink. That smile stretched, but it no longer looked human. It looked hungry. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about marriage. This wasn't about love. This was about control, about power, about a man who could not stand the thought of his wife standing taller than him. My promotion had become my crime. My success was his humiliation. He thought the poison would silence me, just as his words had tried to before. But the truth was louder now, echoing in my head. I couldn't drink. I wouldn't drink. I set the cup down gently, deliberately, as though it was fragile glass. His mask cracked only for a heartbeat. A flicker of disappointment, maybe even panic, flashed across his face before the mask slid back into place. But I had seen it, and it was enough to know I wasn't wrong. Eleanor shifted her voice sharp. It's getting cold. She looked at me as though daring me, almost enjoying the game. I folded my hands and gave her the same smile her son had given me so many times before. Empty, masked. But inside I was already planning my next move. Because if Alexander thought he could bury me with poison, he had underestimated one thing: my instincts. Eleanor had been living in my house for 6 months, and by then she felt less like a guest and more like a warden. Officially, she was there because of a broken hip. She insisted that she needed help with small tasks, that she couldn't manage stairs or carry groceries. But the truth was written in the way she watched me, the way her sharp eyes followed every move I made like a hawk circling prey. At first I tried to be patient. She was my husband's mother after all. I told myself it was temporary, that once she healed, she would return to her own home. But weeks turned into months, and her presence began to smother me. She had opinions about everything: what I wore to work, what I cooked for dinner, how late I stayed at the office. It wasn't care, it was surveillance. I remember one evening when I came home late from the firm. I had just closed a demanding case, and I wanted nothing more than to collapse on the couch. Eleanor was waiting in the kitchen. "Claire," she said, her lips pursed, "you look tired. Don't you think you're pushing yourself too hard?" Her tone wasn't concern. It was accusation. Alexander nodded along, adding, "Your health matters more than any partnership." It was then I began to wonder if they were rehearsing lines together, if his words of sympathy were just an echo of hers. Slowly, their voices blended into one. They wanted me to believe I was unstable, that stress was consuming me. I didn't realize it then, but they were laying the groundwork for something far darker. The more I resisted, the sharper Eleanor's criticisms became. She moved from comments about my work to intrusions into my privacy. I caught her in my office once sitting at my desk, pretending to check her email on my laptop, but she had her own computer. She didn't need mine. When I confronted her, she brushed it off with a cold smile. I was only curious. Curious about what? About my clients, my cases, my schedule. Or was she searching for weakness for evidence she could twist into proof that I was unraveling? She became my shadow. At breakfast, she would watch me stir my coffee, her gaze steady, almost expectant. At night, she would ask if I was sleeping well, then suggest maybe I should see someone for stress. It was subtle at first, but soon it was relentless. A whisper here, a suggestion there. And Alexander always seemed to echo her, his concern rehearsed his sympathy hollow. There is something chilling about being gaslit, not just by one person, but by two mother and son, working in tandem, each reinforcing the other until you begin to doubt the ground beneath your feet. I had moments where I stared into the mirror and wondered if they were right. Was I imagining things? Was I truly breaking down? But then I would remember the hospital, the pain, the unexplained weight loss, the hollow fatigue that clung to me even after rest. Doctors blamed stress. Alexander agreed. Eleanor nodded solemnly. But in my bones I knew it was not stress, it was sabotage. And still I played my part. I smiled at Eleanor when she criticized my cooking. I nodded when she said my hours at the firm were unhealthy. I even allowed her to sit in on my phone calls, pretending not to notice how she scribbled notes in the margins of her crossword puzzles. I gave them the performance they wanted, because sometimes survival is theater. But every night when the house was quiet, I replayed their words in my head. I connected the dots, the broken hip that kept her in my home, the way Alexander's resentment grew sharper with every success I earned. The nights I woke dizzy, trembling, unsure if it was real or just my imagination. It wasn't my imagination, it was their plan. And sitting at that breakfast table, the cup of coffee in front of me, I realized the truth. Eleanor wasn't a bystander, she was a partner. She wasn't just living in my house, she was anchoring the very plot that might one day bury me. And I knew then if I wanted to survive, I had to stop playing their game and start playing mine. Tell me this, have you ever had someone move into your life, into your space, and suddenly nothing felt like yours anymore? Share your story in the comments. I want to know if you've ever felt what it's like to live under someone else's watchful eye. Because when the walls close in, sometimes the only way out is to fight. The evidence of betrayal rarely arrives in one dramatic revelation. Instead, it seeps in quietly, a series of details too sharp to ignore. For me, it began with a single slip of paper, an odd receipt, folded neatly in Alexander's wallet. It was from a chemical supply company. I had found it 2 weeks before my hospital stay. When I asked him about it, he chuckled, brushing me off. I was thinking of taking up photography, he said, waving his hand like it was trivial. But I never saw a camera, never saw film or equipment, and the explanation lodged itself in my mind like a thorn. Then there was my laptop. One morning, I stepped out of the shower and found Eleanor sitting at my desk, my screen glowing. She fumbled when I caught her claiming she needed to check her email. But Eleanor had her own computer. She always had. My laptop held client files, sensitive casework, and personal notes. That excuse was as thin as her smile. I shut the lid firmly, holding her gaze. "Next time, ask," I said. She only tilted her head, lips pursed in disapproval, as if I had done something wrong. I began to notice other things, smaller but undeniable. Food in the fridge tasted off, subtle changes I couldn't explain. I started losing weight, not through effort, but through a persistent nausea that clung to me. Every doctor visit circled back to stress. Stress from long hours, from pressure from responsibility. Alexander and Eleanor nodded along, their faces heavy with concern. But their words were like rehearsed lines in a play I hadn't agreed to perform. I started keeping notes. Every symptom, every strange moment. Every time Alexander made me tea, every time Eleanor watched me eat with those hawk-like eyes. My training as a lawyer taught me to build cases from fragments, and slowly the fragments were forming a pattern. Still, I doubted myself. That is what gaslighting does. It bends your reality until suspicion feels like paranoia. One night, I sat at my desk long after midnight, staring at the receipt from the chemical company I had photographed before returning it to Alexander's wallet. Could I prove anything with it? Not yet. But combined with the hospital visit, combined with Eleanor's intrusion, combined with the unexplained illnesses, it was a thread leading to something darker. I remembered the day Alexander brought home takeout and insisted I try the soup. It tasted metallic, but I forced a smile. That night, I was doubled over in pain. He drove me to the ER, holding my hand with perfect concern. Later, he told the doctor I had been under tremendous stress. I had looked at him then, lying with ease, and something inside me had hardened. The truth was circling closer, and I could feel it pressing in. These weren't coincidences. They weren't stress. They were steps in a plan. And Eleanor wasn't a silent participant. She was actively engaged, digging into my files, planting seeds of doubt, reinforcing Alexander's narrative that I was too fragile to handle success. Late at night, I would open my laptop and imagine her eyes scanning through my work. What was she looking for? Evidence to convince my colleagues that I was unraveling proof that I was incompetent. Every click of the keys felt like an intrusion, every draft like a weapon that could be turned against me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. The bitter smell in the coffee that morning was proof enough. But proof in court and in life requires more than instinct. It requires strategy. And that's when the decision began to take shape inside me. If they wanted to play games with shadows and poison, then I would shine a light so bright they couldn't hide. But first, I had to survive their next move. Because survival wasn't just about living through the day, it was about outsmarting the people who thought I was already broken. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever noticed a detail that others dismissed, but you knew it mattered? A receipt, a phrase, a glance. Share it in the comments. Your instincts may have saved you more than once. For me, those fragments were not just suspicions. They were the beginning of a case, my own case for survival. Memory has a cruel way of looping back to the very moments we wish we could forget. For me, it always circled around the week of my promotion. I had worked nearly a decade at the firm, clawing my way through late nights, endless depositions, and trial prep that consumed every ounce of energy I had. And finally, they named me senior partner. It should have been the happiest chapter of my life. Instead, it became the opening act of my undoing. The celebration was small, just colleagues raising glasses in the conference room, but I remember the pride swelling in my chest. Alexander wasn't there, though. He claimed he was busy, but when I got home that night, he gave me a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "Congratulations," he said. The word sounded heavy, forced, like it scraped his throat on the way out. Then, as though to soften the blow, he added, "It's probably just luck. Don't let it get to your head." I brushed it off at the time, telling myself he was just tired. But the bitterness was already there, simmering beneath the surface. He had wanted that partnership for years. He had been passed over twice. My victory was his failure, and he never forgave me for it. 2 days later, I woke in the dead of night, clutching my stomach, writhing in pain, vomiting, fever, the kind of sickness that makes you wonder if you're dying. Alexander drove me to the ER, his hand wrapped around mine like a lifeline. He played the perfect husband. To the doctors, he explained that I was under enormous stress, that my workload was crushing me, that maybe my body was just rebelling. The doctors agreed, nodding, writing it down. Food poisoning, they said. Nothing serious. But it was serious. I was sick for days. My body weakened. My weight dropped. My colleagues whispered about how pale I looked, how fragile I seemed. And behind me, I could feel Eleanor's gaze, watchful, calculating. She would suggest softly, but often, that maybe I should take a step back. That maybe I wasn't cut out for such responsibility. And Alexander would echo her always with that smile of false concern. It was like watching a stage play where the lines were rehearsed, the actors perfectly synchronized. My success was being rewritten as instability, my strength reframed as fragility. Every time I doubted myself, they were there to push me further toward the edge. And yet somewhere inside, I still clung to the truth. I wasn't weak. I wasn't fragile. I was being poisoned slowly, deliberately. The receipt from the chemical supply company, the strange metallic tang in food and drink, the nausea that refused to leave, it all pointed in one direction. That morning at the table, with the steaming cup of coffee in front of me, it hit me with brutal clarity. This wasn't the first attempt. It was simply the boldest. For months, Alexander had been dosing me carefully, just enough to make me sick, never enough to kill. Until now. And the cruelest part, he wasn't acting alone. Eleanor had been there every step, reinforcing the narrative, shaping the story of the fragile wife. She wasn't simply his mother. She was his accomplice. I remember gripping the sink in the bathroom earlier, staring at my reflection and whispering, "Not this time." Those words became my anchor. They reminded me that even when the world tried to paint me as unstable, my instincts were sharp, my mind clear. But survival is not passive. Survival is strategy. And at that table, staring at Alexander's hungry smile, I realized I had only one choice to turn their game against them. Because they thought I was weak. They thought I was blind. But the truth, I was watching, listening, documenting. And the moment was coming when the mask would shatter. Before I take you to that moment, let me ask you something. If you were in my place, sick for months, surrounded by whispers of stress and fragility, would you believe them, or would you trust your instincts? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to stay with me through the rest of this story, make sure you're subscribed. The next chapter is one you won't want to miss. Because luck had nothing to do with my survival. Preparation did. I returned to the dining room with my pulse steady, though my mind was racing. The cup still sat there untouched, its thin curl of steam twisting in the air like a warning. Alexander's eyes were locked on me the moment I entered. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, arms folded, lips pressed tight as though daring me to make a move. I slipped into my seat, slowly forcing calm into every gesture. On the surface, I looked like the dutiful wife. Inside, I was building my defense, every breath calculated. If I hesitated much longer, they would sense it. If I drank, I was finished. That left me only one option: turn their plan back on them. "Eleanor," I said lightly, forcing warmth into my voice. "You look tired this morning. Would you like some coffee?" Alexander made plenty. Her eyes flickered with something I hadn't seen before. Desire. Eleanor loved coffee. It was one of her few indulgences, but Alexander rarely made it for her. For a moment, she resisted, shaking her head. Oh, I couldn't. But I saw the hunger in her eyes, and I pressed. "Please, let me pour you a cup." I rose before she could protest. My hands didn't tremble as I walked into the kitchen, though my heart was hammering. The coffee pot still sat warm on the counter. I opened the cabinet and pulled down a mug identical to mine. Pouring carefully, I drew from the same pot, but inhaled deeply. This coffee smelled normal, rich, earthy. No trace of almonds, no trace of poison. The trick wasn't in the pot, it was in my cup. I returned to the table, mug in hand, and set it gently in front of Eleanor. She glanced at it, then at me, torn between suspicion and craving. "There you go," I said, smiling as if it were nothing. "Enjoy." As she reached for it, I moved quickly. In one smooth gesture, I leaned forward, pretending to adjust my napkin, and switched our cups. The poisoned one slid in front of her while I reclaimed the safe one I had poured. The switch was seamless, natural, invisible. Eleanor's face lit up with genuine pleasure as she lifted the cup. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice uncharacteristically warm. "Alexander, you should make coffee for your mother more often." I forced a sip from my new cup, letting the aroma fill me. It tasted like what coffee should taste like: bitter, bold, nothing more. Relief flooded through me, though I kept my expression neutral. Across the table, Alexander's mask cracked. His eyes darted between me and Eleanor, panic swelling in his face. It was there for only a heartbeat, but I saw it. Pure terror. He tried to recover his voice, careful. "Anna, why don't you drink your coffee? You said you were tired." I am tired, I replied smoothly, raising the safe cup to my lips. But this smells wonderful. I took another deliberate sip, my eyes never leaving his. That was the moment I knew the power had shifted. For the first time in months, I wasn't the victim. I was in control. Eleanor, meanwhile, drank deeply. She closed her eyes, savoring it, oblivious to the trap her own son had set. And Alexander watched pale and silent as the inevitable began to unfold. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't just surviving. I was building a case. Every look, every word, every reaction, it was evidence. Evidence that one day in front of a jury would prove what they had tried to do to me. And in that instant, watching Eleanor sip what had been meant for me, I realized something chilling. I wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. I was watching justice take root in real time. Have you ever had to make a choice so quick, so decisive, that it changed everything in your life? Tell me in the comments. I want to know the moments when instinct saved you too. Because instinct was saving me now, and instinct was about to reveal the truth. Eleanor lifted the cup with both hands, almost reverent, and took her first long swallow. Steam curled around her face as her eyes fluttered shut, savoring the flavor. I sat back, my own cup resting calmly between my fingers, and finally tasted safety. My coffee was warm, rich, and clean. No bitterness, no chemical sting. Just coffee. But across from me, Alexander wasn't drinking. He was watching. His eyes followed every movement of my lips, his jaw clenched so tightly a vein stood out along his temple. For a man who usually wore charm like a mask, this was raw, pure, undiluted hatred. "Anna," he said softly, though his tone was anything but gentle, "why don't you drink a little more? You'll need the energy today." I met his gaze and smiled over the rim of my cup. "This tastes wonderful. Thank you." The words were measured, deliberate. For the first time, I wasn't playing defense. I was watching him squirm. Eleanor, oblivious, continued sipping. She looked almost pleased, basking in a rare moment of kindness from her son. "This is delicious," she said, her voice unusually bright. "What's your secret, Alexander?" The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Alexander's face turned gray, his eyes flicking between us, as though trying to will the cup out of her hand. His fingers twitched against the table, restless, searching for control that had already slipped away. I leaned forward slightly, pretending to be casual, but my words landed like a blade. "You should really make coffee for your mother more often. She seems to enjoy it." His eyes burned into mine. In that moment, there was no pretense left. No smile. No charm. Just hatred. Raw, seething hatred for the woman who had seen through him, who had dared to flip the script. Eleanor laughed lightly, missing the storm raging across the table. She finished half the cup in 3 long gulps, patting her lips with a napkin. "About time I get some appreciation from my son," she said. Alexander's voice cracked. "Mom, maybe you should?" He stopped, words choking off as though caught in his throat. Panic widened his eyes. I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "Should what?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, because he already knew the answer, and it was sitting in the bottom of his mother's cup. My pulse was steady now. I had the upper hand. The woman who had invaded my home, rifled through my things, whispered doubts about my sanity, was unknowingly swallowing the very poison meant for me. And her son, my husband, was unraveling before my eyes. Still, I kept my composure. That was the lesson of survival: never let them see you falter. "Tell me this, if you were in my seat, staring into the eyes of someone who wanted you gone, what would you do? Would you call them out? Or would you, like me, let them sweat until the truth showed itself?" Leave your answer below. Eleanor drained another sip. Alexander's hand shot out as if to stop her, but it was too late. The cup was already nearly empty. And as I held his gaze, refusing to look away, I realized something extraordinary. For months, they had conspired together, controlling the narrative, making me question my reality. But now, in this single moment, the balance shifted. I wasn't the one under their control anymore. I was the witness, the judge, the survivor, and Alexander was watching the walls close in one swallow at a time. It started subtly. Eleanor's hand, once steady, as she lifted the cup, began to tremble. At first she brushed it off, placing the porcelain mug back onto its saucer with a small clink. Strange, she muttered, fanning herself with her napkin. I feel warm. I watched her carefully, my expression calm, even concerned. Inside, my heart raced, not with fear this time, but with certainty. The poison had taken root. Alexander's head snapped toward her, his face draining of color. Mom, he whispered, his voice sharp with panic. How much did you drink? Eleanor waved him off, dismissive. Most of it, she said, her voice thin. Why? What's her words dissolved into a cough, sharp and rattling. The napkin slipped from her fingers as her breathing turned shallow and uneven. I leaned forward, placing my hand lightly on the table as if ready to help. Eleanor, what's wrong? My voice was calm, even gentle, though every syllable was laced with deliberate precision. Her body stiffened. A violent tremor shot through her arms, and the chair screeched against the hardwood floor as she tried to stand. But her legs buckled. She crumpled forward, knocking the chair over with a deafening crash. Alexander was on his knees beside her in an instant, his hands clumsy as he tried to steady her head. No. His voice broke raw and ragged. You weren't supposed to drink that. The words hung in the air like a gunshot, a confession disguised as horror. I rose slowly, pulling my phone from my pocket. My fingers moved with deliberate calm as I dialed. I'm calling 911, I said, my tone steady, unwavering. Alexander's head jerked up, his eyes wide-wiled. Anna, wait. He grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. You don't understand. I yanked free, glaring down at him. I understand perfectly, I said. My voice had steel in it now. You've been poisoning me for months. Small doses. Enough to make me weak, unstable, to make everyone believe I couldn't handle my career. And now you tried to make it lethal. Eleanor convulsed, foam collecting at the corner of her mouth. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, each one weaker than the last. Alexander broke sobbing, his hands pressing uselessly against her chest as though he could force the poison out. It wasn't supposed to be this way, he choked. The coffee, it was supposed to be the last dose. Just enough to send you back to the hospital, to make you look unstable, to make them question your promotion. His voice cracked. You were supposed to be weakened, not... He couldn't finish. I stared at him, my phone pressed to my ear as the dispatcher's voice filled the line. Emergency services, what's your address? I gave it calmly, clearly, my eyes never leaving Alexander's crumbling face. My mother-in-law has been poisoned with cyanide, I said, enunciating every word. Send help immediately. The dispatcher's tone sharpened. How do you know it's cyanide? Because it was meant for me, I replied. But I switched the cups. Alexander's sobs filled the room. His hands trembled as he tried to lift Eleanor as though sheer will could undo what he had set in motion. But the truth was undeniable. He had confessed, and she was slipping away. I stood tall, my phone still in hand, my body calm amid the chaos. For months they had chipped away at me, gaslighting, undermining, poisoning. But now, in this moment, their mask was gone. The truth was raw, unfiltered, undeniable. And I felt something I hadn't in months: power. If you're still with me right now, let me pause to ask, have you ever heard someone reveal the truth when the pressure was too much? A slip of the tongue, a crack in the mask. Tell me below. Your story matters. Because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive in silence. Sometimes it screams out in panic, just like Alexander's voice when he realized his mother had taken my place. The sound of Eleanor's gasps still echoed in the room as I lowered the phone from my ear. I could hear the sirens in the distance already, a haunting reminder that help was on its way, but not for Alexander. He sat crumpled on the floor, his hands shaking as he tried to lift his mother's head, his words tumbling out in broken fragments. It was supposed to be small doses. He stammered, his eyes locked on mine with a desperation that almost looked like pleading. Not enough to kill, just enough to keep you weak, to keep you off balance. His voice cracked. You were supposed to doubt yourself, Anna. Everyone else was supposed to doubt you too. They'd think it was stress or paranoia or exhaustion. The puzzle pieces snapped together with brutal clarity. The months of nausea, the unexplained weight loss, the whispers about my health, the doctors who nodded when Alexander told them I was stressed. It was never random. It was never me. It was him. I crouched down not to comfort him, but to make sure he heard me clearly. So all those nights I woke up sick, shaking, wondering if I was losing my mind. That was you. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. It was supposed to work, he choked. You'd go back to the hospital. They'd think you couldn't handle the pressure. The firm would reconsider. They'd give the partnership to me. It was supposed to be clean. Clean. My voice was sharp, each word deliberate. You were poisoning me, Alexander. Slowly, deliberately, while your mother gaslit me into believing it was all in my head. He collapsed forward, his forehead pressing into Eleanor's shoulder. It wasn't supposed to end like this. She wasn't supposed to drink it. But she had. And his plan had backfired spectacularly. I stood slowly, letting my gaze linger on the overturned chair, the spilled napkin, the trembling man on the floor. The whole scene looked like a courtroom exhibit, frozen in time. The victim, the perpetrator, and the witness. And in that instant, I realized something chilling, but empowering. He had underestimated me. He thought ambition had blinded me. He thought love had silenced me. But I had been watching, recording, building my case one detail at a time. The sirens grew louder, closer, the sound bouncing off the walls of our quiet home. Alexander's shoulders shook, his sobs no longer those of a husband grieving for his wife's mother. They were the cries of a man who knew the net was tightening around him. You'll ruin everything, he muttered, his voice muffled against Eleanor's limp body. They'll see me as a monster. I looked down at him, my voice steady, cold. They'll see the truth. And the truth was undeniable now. The mask had shattered. The careful game of small doses and whispered doubts was exposed for what it was: attempted murder born from jealousy so deep it consumed them both. Before I take you into the moment the paramedics arrived, I want you to sit with this question. If someone you trusted, someone who promised to love you, slowly tried to erase your strength, would you see the signs? Or would you dismiss them as stress like I almost did? Share your thoughts below, because sometimes survival depends on asking the questions no one else dares to. As the sirens stopped outside and flashing lights painted the curtains red and blue, I knew this chapter was closing. But the battle for justice was only just beginning, because survival wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning of theirs unraveling. The front door burst open with a crash of urgency, and suddenly the room was filled with paramedics. Red and blue lights from the ambulance splashed across the walls, flickering like a warning beacon. They dropped to their knees beside Eleanor, their movements brisk, efficient, practiced. One of them slipped an oxygen mask over her face. Another began checking her vitals, but I saw it in their eyes. They already knew. What did she ingest? One asked, sharp-clipped. Cyanide, I said, my voice steady. The man's head snapped toward me. How do you know that? I met his gaze without flinching. Because it was meant for me. I switched the cups. A flicker of shock passed between the medics, but they didn't waste time on questions. They kept working, but Eleanor's body told the truth: they were fighting a battle already lost. Her breathing was ragged, her pulse erratic. Foam lingered at the corners of her lips. Alexander hovered uselessly, his hands twitching, his words spilling out in broken fragments. Please save her. She didn't mean she wasn't supposed. His voice cracked under the weight of panic. I stood back, arms crossed, watching. For months, he and his mother had orchestrated every move, whispering lies, planting doubts. Now, in the bright glare of flashing lights, the script had flipped. The perfect son, the devoted mother, both exposed. I couldn't stop myself from speaking. She helped you, didn't she? My voice cut through the chaos. She's the one who went through my files, the one who whispered that I was too fragile, that I should step back before I embarrassed the family. Alexander froze, his eyes darting up to mine. For a moment, the mask slipped again, and I saw it: confirmation. She said you were getting too big for your britches, he admitted, voice raw. That you needed to be put back in your place. She thought she was helping me. Helping. That word tasted like poison itself. Eleanor hadn't been a bystander. She'd been an accomplice, playing her role in a script designed to erase me. And now the curtain was closing on her final act. The paramedics exchanged a look I knew too well. I had seen it in courtrooms and hospitals, in moments where truth could no longer be disguised. One of them shook his head slightly. The other kept working, but slower now, less hopeful. I swallowed hard, not out of grief, but of recognition. This was justice ugly and merciless, delivered not by my hand, but by theirs. They had dug their own grave sip by sip, whisper by whisper, and yet even in this chaos I couldn't shake the thought of how close I had come to being the one on that floor. How close they had come to winning. I turned to the medics again. "Do you need the chemical source? I know where he keeps it." My voice was calm, deliberate, already cataloging evidence in my mind. They looked up startled, but I continued before they could ask. "In his study, hidden with his so-called photography supplies. You'll find potassium cyanide, and if you search his laptop, you'll see emails, plans, messages between him and Eleanor about my supposed instability." Alexander lunged toward me, his face twisted in desperation. "Stop, don't." The medic stepped between us, holding him back with one firm arm. Alexander's protests turned to sobs, but I felt no pity. He had chosen ambition over love, jealousy over loyalty, and in that choice he had lost everything. "I want to ask you something now. If someone you loved tried to sabotage you, would you still call it love? Or would you call it what it truly is? Control dressed in the language of care. Tell me below, because too many people mistake chains for devotion." Eleanor's breaths were shallow, now fading. The monitors beeped slower, weaker, until silence filled the room. One paramedic closed her eyes gently, covering her body with a sheet. And as Alexander collapsed beside her, wailing into the fabric, I felt the weight of truth settle over me. For months they had tried to make me doubt myself. Now their lies lay dead on the floor. But this wasn't the end. This was only evidence, the beginning of the trial that would expose everything. The sirens faded as the ambulance pulled away, carrying Eleanor's body toward the hospital. But I already knew she wouldn't return. The woman who had invaded my home, who had whispered doubts into every corner of my life, had swallowed the very poison meant for me. And now the only person left in the room was Alexander, my husband, my would-be killer. Two uniformed officers stood in the doorway. Their eyes scanned the scene quickly. The overturned chair, the shattered look on Alexander's face, and me calm. Steady, the only one standing. One officer approached. "Ma'am, we'll need to ask you some questions." "I'll answer everything I said clearly." My voice did not tremble. I pointed toward the study. "You'll find evidence there. A receipt for potassium cyanide, emails on his laptop, bottles of chemicals hidden with photography supplies." Alexander's head snapped up. "Don't listen to her. She's paranoid. She's been unstable for months." His words tumbled out frantic, as though he believed he could still spin the story. But the officer's eyes narrowed. He'd heard that excuse before, too many times. I reached into my folder on the counter, pulling out the photographs I had taken weeks earlier, the chemical receipt, the odd notes I had logged in secret. I had prepared these knowing the day would come when truth had to meet proof. I handed them over without hesitation. "These are my records. My medical files show a pattern of poisoning. Every episode aligned with moments in my career when I succeeded and he failed." The officers exchanged a glance. One cuffed Alexander's wrists behind his back as the other read him his rights. His voice shook as he shouted, "You can't do this. She's lying." But the more he screamed, the clearer the truth became. I stood back watching him thrash against the cuffs. It was almost surreal. For months he had been in control. For months he had been the one holding the strings, dosing my drinks, planting seeds of doubt. And now he was the one pleading powerless, being dragged from the home he thought he controlled. My hands shook not from fear, but from release. The cage they had built around me had cracked open. As the officers led him past me, he turned eyes, wild, voice breaking. "You'll regret this. They'll never believe you." I held his gaze and spoke calmly. "They will, because I kept every receipt, every symptom, every lie." His face twisted, caught between rage and despair before the door shut behind him. The house fell quiet then. For the first time in half a year, silence wasn't oppressive. It was liberating. I sank into a chair, staring at the empty coffee cup on the table. That small porcelain mug had carried death, and yet it had also carried survival. For months I had doubted myself. Tonight I had proof. Tonight I had won. But the battle wasn't over. The trial was coming. Evidence had to be organized, testimony prepared. The courtroom would be my stage, and I would no longer be the victim. I would be the witness who refused to stay silent. I want to pause here and ask you something important. If you had the chance to collect proof against someone hurting you, would you risk everything to hold on to it, or would you let it slide hoping things would get better? Share your answer, because sometimes evidence is the only lifeline that keeps the truth alive. That night, as I locked the study door and tucked my files into a safe place, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: the story they had tried to write for me was over. The new story, the one I would tell on the stand, was just beginning, and this time it would end with justice. The trial began months later, but in truth it felt like the culmination of every shadow that had followed me through the past year. By then, the case had already earned a name in the headlines: the coffee cup murder. Newspapers ran it daily, cameras swarmed the courthouse steps, and people whispered when they passed me in the hallway. Walking into that courtroom the first day, I carried two things with me: my case files and the quiet fire of survival. I wasn't stepping in as a victim anymore. I was a lawyer, a woman trained to build cases from fragments of truth, and now my own life was the evidence. The prosecution laid it out methodically. They showed the jury my medical records patterns of unexplained illness, each episode coinciding with moments of my professional success. They displayed the receipt from the chemical supplier, the emails between Alexander and Eleanor that painted a chilling portrait of conspiracy. The jury saw text after text where they discussed my instability, their subtle plot to destroy me under the guise of concern. And then came my testimony. For 3 days, I sat in the witness box and told my story, piece by piece. I spoke about the hospital stay, the nausea, the whispered suggestions that maybe I was working too hard. I described finding Eleanor at my laptop, the faint taste of metal in my food, the morning of the coffee cup. But the most powerful moment wasn't in what I said, it was in how Alexander reacted. Every word seemed to chip away at the mask he still tried to wear. The jury saw the cracks. They saw his sudden outbursts, the flashes of anger he couldn't contain when I described how he resented my promotion. His defense tried to spin it. They claimed he was depressed, that he had planned to take his own life with cyanide, and Eleanor had mistakenly drunk it. But the evidence didn't bend to that story. Not when the receipts matched the timeline. Not when my medical files showed months of poisoning. Not when Eleanor herself had been caught in his emails plotting how to handle me before I embarrassed the family. The courtroom became a theater of truth, and for once I wasn't the one doubting. I wasn't the one second-guessing every feeling, every instinct. I was steady, methodical, laying out the case not just against Alexander, but against every lie he had ever tried to wrap me in. On the third day of testimony, I remember pausing to look at the jury. 12 strangers. Their eyes were wide, their pens scratching quickly. They weren't just hearing facts. They were seeing the picture, the slow unraveling of a marriage built on jealousy, control, and deceit. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions. How does it feel to testify against your own husband? Do you believe justice will be served? I didn't answer then. I saved my words for the stand. Because inside that courtroom, my story wasn't just about me. It was about every person who had been told they were imagining things. Every person gaslit into believing their strength was weakness. Every person silenced by someone too afraid of their success. Before I bring you to the verdict, let me leave you with this. Have you ever stood up in front of people who doubted you and spoken your truth anyway? Tell me in the comments. Your courage might be the voice someone else needs to hear. That trial was more than evidence. It was more than a legal battle. It was a reckoning. And as the final witnesses took the stand, I felt the weight of justice pressing closer. The truth was no longer whispered in kitchens or hidden in cups of coffee. The truth was out loud, undeniable, echoing through the walls of the courtroom. And I knew justice was coming. The day of the verdict arrived with a tension so heavy I could feel it pressing into my skin. The courtroom was hushed, filled with the rustle of papers, the faint cough of a spectator, and the ever-present gaze of the press lining the back benches. I sat upright at the plaintiff's table, my palms resting flat, steady. Across from me, Alexander sat in his suit wrists, free of cuffs for the sake of appearance. But his posture betrayed him. Shoulders hunched, lips pressed tight, eyes darting like a cornered animal. The jury filed in one by one. Their faces were unreadable, but I searched them anyway, looking for clues. My heart thudded against my ribs, not out of fear, but anticipation. This was the moment where all the fragments, every hospital stay, every bitter sip of food, every whispered doubt would converge into a single truth. The foreman stood. The judge asked the question. On the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a hammer striking stone. A ripple moved through the spectators. I sat frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The foreman continued. On the charge of attempted murder, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. 2 words, just 2, and with them months of torment collapsed into justice. Alexander's head dropped into his hands. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked small, defeated. The mask of arrogance had shattered completely. The judge's voice cut through the noise, declaring the sentence life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Life, no second chances, no opportunity to crawl back into my life, no power left to wield. I exhaled slow and deliberate. Around me, reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, people whispered. But I heard none of it. All I could hear was the sound of freedom, the sound of a door slamming shut behind the man who tried to erase me. As Alexander was led away, his eyes flicked toward me one last time. There was no love there, no remorse, only rage. Rage that I had survived, rage that I had beaten him at his own game. But rage couldn't touch me anymore, not now. The prosecutor leaned close. You did it, she whispered. Your testimony carried the case. I nodded, though I already knew. For months I had doubted myself. I had believed their lies, their gaslighting, their manipulation, but today proved the truth. My instincts had saved me. My persistence had condemned him. Walking out of the courtroom, the flash of cameras blinded me. A reporter's voice rose above the noise. How does it feel to see justice served? I paused at the courthouse steps. The cold air filled my lungs, crisp and sharp. I spoke not just to the cameras, but to every person who had ever been told they were too fragile, too paranoid, too unstable to trust themselves. It feels like freedom, I said. It feels like justice. And here I want to ask you, if you had the chance to confront the person who tried to break you, what would you say? Drop your answer below. Your words matter because silence only protects the guilty. And if you want to hear how this story doesn't end, here make sure you're subscribed. The next chapter is about more than survival. It's about rising. As the crowd pressed closer, as microphones extended toward me, I felt a new strength settle in my bones. Alexander's conviction was not the end of my story. It was the foundation for something greater. Because justice wasn't just served in the courtroom. Justice was living freely, fully, and unapologetically, something he could never take from me again. 6 months after the trial ended, I walked back into a courtroom. But this time, I wasn't defending my own life. I was fighting for hundreds of others who had been silenced. The case was against a pharmaceutical company that had knowingly concealed dangerous side effects of one of its most profitable drugs. I had built it piece by piece, just like I had built my own survival. And as I stood before the jury, I knew that everything I had endured had prepared me for this moment. The trial was grueling, lasting weeks. Executives tried to hide behind legal jargon, their lawyers twisted timelines, but the evidence was clear. I presented testimonies from patients who had lost their health, from families who had lost loved ones. I showed memos where executives joked about acceptable casualties. I laid bare the truth they had buried. On the final day, as I delivered my closing argument, I felt the same fire I had felt when I faced Alexander in that dining room. My voice didn't waver. This case is about accountability, I told the jury. It's about truth. And it's about the lives that matter more than profit margins. When the verdict was read, the jury awarded damages of $200 million. The company's stock plummeted overnight. 3 executives were arrested. And I, once the woman who had been gaslit into doubting her own reality, stood tall, recognized as one of the top trial lawyers in the state. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps once again. One asked, "How does it feel to win such a massive case so soon after your personal tragedy?" I looked into the cameras and said, "It feels like justice. Not just for my clients, but for everyone who has ever been told they're imagining things. For everyone who's been silenced or dismissed. Surviving doesn't make you weak. Surviving makes you stronger." The crowd erupted with questions, but I didn't stop. I needed my words to cut through the noise. My husband tried to poison me because he couldn't stand that I was succeeding where he had failed. He wanted me to believe I was fragile, unstable. But here's the truth: being targeted doesn't make you fragile. Fighting back makes you powerful. That moment became more than a press conference. It was a declaration. My voice, once stifled by manipulation, now carried across headlines, inspiring others who had been doubted. People wrote to me letters from strangers, emails from women who whispered that they too had felt silenced in their homes, their careers, their lives. They told me my story made them believe in themselves again. Justice in the courtroom mattered, but justice in their voices mattered more. Let me ask you now, have you ever been told you were too sensitive, too dramatic, too fragile, when in truth you were simply right? Share your story below. And if you want to keep standing with me in stories of survival and strength, subscribe. Together, we're not just listening, we're building a community. As I walked away from the courthouse that day, the weight of victory didn't feel like triumph alone. It felt like proof that survival wasn't the end of my journey. It was the foundation of something far greater. I had won my case. I had claimed my freedom. And for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was rising. 3 years after Alexander's conviction, I unlocked the glass door of my own law firm for the very first time. The nameplate gleamed in the morning sun. Claire Morgan Attorney at Law. And just below it, in smaller letters that only I insisted on adding, were 3 words: trust your instincts. That phrase had saved my life. It reminded me of the morning when bitter almonds in a cup of coffee told me more than any doctor ever had. It reminded me that while others tried to convince me I was fragile, my instincts had screamed otherwise. And I had listened. The office was small, modest, compared to the firm where I had once fought for recognition, but it was mine. The walls were lined with books I had collected through years of practice. On the desk sat a single object out of place, a white porcelain coffee mug, the very one Alexander had poisoned for me. I kept it not as a relic of fear, but as a reminder. Sometimes the greatest threats come from inside your own home. And sometimes survival is the loudest defiance. Clients soon filled my office. Many were people who had been ignored or dismissed, workers silenced by corporations, women gaslit by partners, families robbed of their voices. They came to me because they heard my story, because they knew I had not only survived, but had turned my pain into power. And I fought for them with the same fire I had once used to fight for myself. Each case was different, but the thread was the same people longing to be believed. And I made sure they were. There were moments late at night when I would sit in the quiet of my office and reflect. Alexander was serving life without parole. Eleanor was gone. Their ambition, their jealousy, their cruelty, it had ended with them. But me, I was still here, stronger, clearer, free. And yet the lesson was never lost on me. Love can disguise itself as care while quietly eroding your strength. Loyalty can be twisted into chains. But freedom, the kind you carve out with truth and courage, is worth every scar. I often tell my clients, don't mistake silence for peace. Don't mistake control for love. And never doubt the small voice inside you that says something is wrong. Because I had doubted myself once, and it almost cost me everything. Now I want to leave you with this final thought. If you've walked with me through this story, I ask you carry it forward. Trust your instincts. Share your experiences in the comments. Let someone else know they're not alone. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and stay. Because survival is never the end. It's the beginning of something stronger. That night, after locking up my new office, I went home, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Alexander once tried to end me. The coffee was dark, strong, and honest, just like me. I lifted the mug, savoring the warmth, and whispered the words that had carried me through it all. I'm still here. And I always will be. The seasons have turned many times since that morning, when a poisoned cup of coffee almost claimed my life. I no longer wake with dread, no longer scan every glance for hidden malice. Instead, I wake to possibility, to a life I built piece by piece, after tearing away the lies that once bound me. My law firm has grown, but not in size alone. It has become a place where people come to be heard. Clients sit across from me, their hands trembling as they share stories of betrayal, silencing, or fear. I listen, and I tell them what I know to be true. Survival is not weakness. Survival is strength. Every scar they carry is proof they are still standing. Sometimes when the office is quiet, I pause and look at that porcelain mug resting on my desk. It is not just an artifact of pain, it is a reminder of the day I chose myself. The day I trusted my instincts even when everyone else told me not to. It reminds me that danger doesn't always roar from the outside. Sometimes it whispers from within your own home. Yet more than anything, it reminds me of resilience. That life does not end with betrayal. That freedom can be rebuilt stronger and brighter than before. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Never doubt that quiet voice inside you. It might save your life one day. So now when I pour my morning coffee, I smile. The taste is bold, untainted, honest, just like me. And as I sip, I remind myself I am still here. Still strong, still fighting, and I always will be.